Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, we are diving right in today because we're going on an absolutely thrilling philosophical journey. We're going to deconstruct how human beings actually construct truth, meaning, and reality itself. I know, it sounds super heavy, but I promise you, by the end of this explainer, the way you look at knowledge, and literally even your own thoughts, is going to fundamentally change.
We're grounding all of this today in a really fascinating 10-part spoken essay series by ZT Tosha. It serves as a reflection on our physical book, The Inherited Throne, A Restoration of the Hierophant. And look, this isn't just some basic summary we're doing here. We are tracing the core conceptual field Tosha lays out, which is this brilliant mapping of structure, interpretation, and how meaning itself even becomes possible to us in the first place.
So, part 1, the silent structure, precision without words.
I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you stumble upon this tangible, ancient mystery, a structure exhibiting perfect alignment and geometry, but entirely without words. This totally defies how we usually interpret evidence, and it poses a massive question. Does intelligence actually need language to exist? We are so deeply trained to assume that it must, but here we see perfect precision without a single word of explanation.
Tosha actually puts this beautifully. She says, "Constraint does not need to explain itself in order to persist." I want you to just let that sink in for a second. Forms, geometries, structural alignments, they can survive for centuries entirely outside the authority of language. Knowledge, in this sense, isn't what is communicated. It's what remains completely stable when communication disappears.
Which brings us to part 2, the drift of meaning. Interpretation moves. But, well, we're human, right? We kind of hate silence. When we look at these silent structures, our immediate reflex is to just fill that void with our own narratives. We're trained to treat structural excess as a symbol or an intention or some cultural belief. And to explain how we do this, Tosha introduces a really crucial concept called the Hierophant function. Now, this isn't a person in a robe, it's a structural mechanism. It's the invisible translator that converts physical residue, those silent, ancient structures, into meaning. As time passes and we lose direct contact with the origins of those structures, we end up relying entirely on this Hierophant function to act as a mediator and basically stabilize what we're looking at.
And this leads us to a really tricky problem, structural drift. You see, interpretation absolutely demands coherence. It just cannot tolerate silence or unexplainable gaps. So to preserve meaning across generations, interpretation starts to adjust. It smooths out the contradictions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, interpretation shifts from actually describing the original structure to replacing it entirely. Later generations aren't reading the structure itself anymore. They're just encountering an inherited, adapted interpretation of it.
Moving on to part 3, authority without origin. Continuity as legitimacy. So what actually happens when an interpretation just solidifies over a super long period of time? Well, it stops being a reading of the past and morphs into a full-blown institution. It completely loses contact with its starting point. Let's compare these two states. On one hand, you have external reality. It's full of friction, discontinuity, and it requires constant external validation. But on the other hand, internal coherence is smooth, self-referential, and continuous. When an interpretive system matures into an authority, it literally stops verifying its truth against that messy external reality. Instead, it just tests new data against its own past interpretations. Continuity becomes legitimacy. It forgets its origin point entirely, because frankly, it no longer needs it to function.
All right, part 4, the closed reality, self-sustaining systems.
Things get a little chilling here in the explainer. Once a system stops checking the outside world, it becomes completely self-referential and self-sustaining. It literally generates its own conditions of what is real. Let's track how this Hierophant function actually evolves. Step 1. It starts out as a simple mediator of meaning, translating those silent structures. Step 2. It mutates into a stabilizer of authority, keeping the institution continuous. And then finally, step 3, it becomes a generator of perceptual conditions. It's no longer just translating reality, it is the very fabric that dictates what is allowed to appear as a valid experience within the system.
So what does this closed system do when it bumps into incompatible data? It doesn't just violently reject it. That would cause way too much friction. It does something way more subtle to protect itself. It reinterprets the anomaly. It reclassifies the contradiction. It redistributes the tension and refines its definitions. It quietly filters out the mismatch until that data just becomes structurally irrelevant. It simply disappears from intellectual continuity.
Part 5. Filtering Thought and Visibility. Conditions of Visibility.
Now, I want you to apply this directly to your own mind. This isn't just about some abstract ancient history anymore. This is a massive warning about how stabilized systems dictate what it is even possible for you and me to perceive right now. Tosha points out that a hierarchy of appearance takes over. It organizes not just what's considered true, but what is even allowed to appear as thinkable. The crazy reality here is that alternatives to the system aren't aggressively banned, they just fail to stabilize in our perception. They literally don't register as a signal. Disagreement doesn't look like opposition, it just looks like a total absence of information. We never even see the alternatives.
And this perfectly explains why certain thoughts completely dominate our world. Ideas do not survive because they are correct, they survive because they are repeatable. Thought itself is under this intense selection pressure. Ideas that smoothly align with the internal coherence of the system survive because they're easy to transmit. Ideas that cause friction, that challenge the core structure, well, they require way too much effort to maintain, and so they simply stop being thought.
So if our very perception and our thoughts are being filtered by the system we inhabit, it begs the ultimate question, doesn't it? What happens when the observer is part of the system? I want to pull the rug out from under you for a second, bringing this whole abstract journey right into your own head. Because up until now, we've kind of been assuming there's a separate us safely looking at the system from the outside.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, The Observer Returns, the Epistemic Collapse. Here is the final twist. This is where the loop completely closes in on itself, and where Tosha's philosophical framework reaches this staggering conclusion. At this stage, epistemic distance literally collapses. The separation between what's being observed and the framework that enables the observation totally disappears. We are not outside the system. We're not neutral. The very act of us describing the structure includes us as the observer. This means reality is being co-generated, not just interpreted. We can never step outside the system to objectively view it, because we are the system observing itself. The description and the describer are one continuous, inescapable loop. And that reveals the true nature of everything we've been talking about today. As Tosha writes, the inherited throne was never a position of authority. It was the structure that made positions appear at all. We aren't just sitting on the throne of our own perception. The throne is what built us. So if your very perception is generated by the structure you reside in, how much of what you call reality is actually just the system admiring its own reflection? Thank you so much for joining me on this profound journey today. I'll see you in the next explainer.